Okay, so just by way of recap, we're here in chapter 2 of Romans. In the previous Bible study, we talked about the first 11 verses in chapter 2, and we talked about the judgments that we oftentimes make, and oftentimes how those judgments differ from the judgments that God himself makes and the righteous judgments that God makes. And so that's sort of the beginning part of chapter 2 here is this topic on judging and judgments. The Jews were set on sort of placing certain judgments against their Gentile counterparts. And they were upset, maybe not upset, but they condemned them and judged them in ways that they themselves didn't want to be judged by. It was sort of a double standard, hypocrisy, you might say. And so Paul really gets in and comments to them about how this type of one-sided judgment is not right, it's not what God does. And how God will render to each one according to his deeds that we read there in verse 6. So with that sort of as a background, then we move into the second section. You might recall that this third chapter has 3 sections. We'll finish out the second section and begin section 3 hopefully this evening. But here in section 2, we begin in verse 12 is where we picked up from last time. Romans chapter 2 and verse 12. For as many have sinned without law will also perish without law, and as many as have sinned in the law will be judged by the law. So at first glance, you're like, wow, it's a really big sentence, right? It's a really heavy sentence. We have those who have sinned, and without law, they'll perish without the law, and sinned in the law, they'll be judged by the law. And it's like, wow, I need to read that maybe a few more times to sort of understand what's going on. What Paul is saying here in verse 12 is we have these two groups, you might say, these two categories of individuals. You have those that have sinned without the law, and then those who have sinned in the law. Okay, so if we break the verse down, we essentially have these two groups of individuals. One, you're sinning without the law. The other one, you're sinning in the law. We know from a statement that Peter makes that everyone has sinned, and so everyone sort of fall into one of these two categories, right? There's not a third option of, and those who have never sinned as part of the law, right? Paul doesn't include that option because we've all sinned and we all will sin. And so we all fit into one of these two categories. So these are the two categories that Paul brings out here. Everyone has sinned. You're either going to do so without the law or in the law. Okay, so that's sort of where this verse starts. If we sin, verse 12, without the law, then we'll perish without the law. And if we sin in the law, we'll be judged by the law. So he sort of says, okay, there's two groups. Now let's talk about how they're judged, how each of those groups will be judged. Those who know God's written word and his law are going to be judged by them. Okay, so for the audience of Paul's day, for those of us here, for those that the Father has called, John 6:44, we're going to be judged according to the law. So we can't expect to stand in the judgment day and say, okay, if I had my option, I'd like to be judged, as if I didn't know the law, right? Because I think that might end up being better off for me, right? No, we don't have that sort of choice. We know God's law. We know his written word. And so God's trying to judge us according to that. Those who have never read a Bible, those who haven't been called, they should still understand the basics of right and wrong. Right. So if we go back to chapter 1, and we won't review chapter 1, but if you sort of flash back to our discussion in chapter 1, you'll remember that just a little bit before where we are now, back in chapter 1, Paul discusses this, and he talks about how you may have rejected God, but in order to reject God, you have to acknowledge that there is some level of of God involvement, right? You can go off and be unclean and have lust of your heart and dishonor bodies. This is verse 24. But deep down inside, you really know that there's a stark difference between right and wrong, right? So what Paul then is getting to here in verse 12 is you may be sort of outside. You may not know God. You maybe have never been called. Maybe you're worshiping the other Christ. At any rate, you still have a basis of knowing right from wrong, basic right and wrong. And so this is where Paul is coming to here in verse 12. Even those who don't know the law that God has not called, they'll still be judged according to those basics of the law that they should have known. In other words, what Paul is saying here in verse 12 is ignorance is no excuse. Right? Ignorance is no excuse. Let's keep with this train of thought. Let's jump over to the book of James. We're going to be going a few different times here to James. James, we believe, is the brother of Jesus. Here in James chapter 2 and verse 8, notice James chapter 2 and verse 8, if you really fulfill the royal law according to Scripture, and then he quotes, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you do well. But if you show partiality, you commit sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. So here James is sort of saying the same thing, right? You understand this basic principle of loving your neighbor as yourself. And yet if you ignore that basic principle, even if you're not part of the church, right? Even if you ignore that basic principle, then you're showing partiality, right? And there's sin that you've committed. On the other hand, if you keep that royal law, if you keep that aspect of the law, James says you do well, right? Good job. This is what you're expected to do. So if we come back here to Romans chapter 2 and verse 12, Paul and James are saying the same thing, just in different words. Doesn't matter if you have been called or not, there's still a basic level of expectation that God has on you. Okay, think back to the story of Jonah. Right, Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh. The Ninevites were they were all over the Israelites. They were causing problems for them. Jonah didn't want God to save them. Jonah wanted God just to wipe them out. Right, and so God sent him there to give a basic message of repentance. Right, it wasn't plan of salvation, start keeping the Sabbath and all of that. It was a basic level of morality and ethics, right? And Nineveh responded, and God spared them. That civilization lived on for another, history tells us, about 150 years, right? So God did not destroy them. They came back to what Paul is referring to here in verse 12. They were without the law from that perspective. God wasn't calling them, wasn't giving them a message of salvation and truth like he was to ancient Israel. But yet there was still this baseline that every human should know and should follow. If a police pulls you over and you say, I didn't realize the speed limit dropped, right? I was next to the semi-truck, the sign must have passed, I didn't see it. Right? The police officer is not going to say, in that case, no worries. Continue on, right? He's going to say, too bad, right? Here's your ticket and here's your court date. It simply doesn't work that way. If ignorance of the law is the only way to save people, then the mission of the church should be to keep people in ignorance. Right? It's kind of an interesting concept, right? If ignorance is bliss, if ignorance is okay, and if God will sort of turn this eye from ignorance and say, you didn't know, right? You didn't know that you should treat your neighbor as yourself and do some of these other basic things. Since you didn't know that, then it's okay. Just have this pass. Right? Paul here in verse 12 is saying that's not the way it works, right? Ignorance isn't bliss. It's simply not the way God designed his plan. So even those who have sinned without the law, they're going to perish without the law. And as many as have sinned in the law will be judged by the law. There's still a judgment to both groups. Right? There's still a judgment to both groups. A person may not know about the Sabbath and the holy days and about maybe even idolatry, but if they break those laws, they'll still have consequences that come to them and a related judgment for that sin. Let's jump over to chapter 7, Romans chapter 7. And verse 7, this is one of Paul's famous, if this, then could this be the scenario? And he was like, you're crazy. Certainly not. Okay, so Romans 7:7. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? Is the law bad? Is the law something that's sort of bind me and hold me tight and be restrictive and oppressive? Is it bad? Is the law sin? Certainly not. On the contrary, I would not have known sin except through the law. For I would not have known covetousness unless the law had said, you shall not covet. Would you escape the penalties of coveting just because you're unaware of it? We would say, well, no, that's silly. There's still, it's still in effect in your life. And if you break it, whether you know it or not, there's still consequences that come from the breaking of that. God doesn't bring a special curse if a person sins in ignorance. Right? There are natural consequences, and this is what we talked about a little bit at the end of chapter 1. There are those natural consequences that come from breaking God's laws. If you break the law, the curse, you might say, is automatic. Right? You climb up on top of the roof and jump off thinking that you won't get hurt. Well, you're going to at least sprain your ankle, best case. Worst case, you're going to break a bone or two. God doesn't have to bring down some sort of special curse and say, oh, they broke the law of gravity. Right? That there are natural consequences for breaking God's laws. If you steal, there's going to be problems. Right? There's going to be problems in your life, especially if that stealing is habitual. If you do it with your employer, you may eventually lose your job. Whatever the situation, it's going to bring problems for you in society if you steal. You don't have to bring a special curse on someone if they murder. Right? We have laws of the land that deal with that situation. So what we're reading here in chapter 2 and verse 1 is essentially there is a law. There are these universal laws. God is working and calling with certain individuals and exposing his laws to a greater depth to them and allowing them to understand them to a deeper level to the point that they can have a relationship with God. But there is a basis that everyone should understand. And everyone then will have that judgment. Verse 13, for not the hearers of the law are just in the sight of God, but the doers of the law will be justified. So Paul talks a lot throughout the book of Romans about being just, and he uses this word justified, and we think of justified as this really complicated religious word, and maybe our eyes sometimes glaze over when we think of being justified, or this person was justified, or justification, and I really don't understand what that means, and we sort of glaze over. Verse 13 is actually a great verse to realize Paul's position on the law and the Christian life. And he uses the word just and justified here in verse 13. And it simply means to be brought into a right relationship with God. That's all the word justification means, or to be justified. It's just a bringing of a person into a right relationship with God. And so when somebody is made just, or they're identified, they're characterized as being a just person, or they're justified, or there's justification that's being passed on to that person. It simply means in various ways that person is being brought into a right relationship with God. So don't get all sort of shut down whenever you come across a verse that uses the word just or justified. It just means that person is coming into a right relationship with God. So now let's go back and reread verse 13 now that we know what a couple of these words mean. For not the hearers of the law are just in the sight of God. Okay, so by hearing the law only, it doesn't bring you into a right relationship with God, right? That's what the first part of this verse is saying. For not the hearers of the law are just in the sight of God. If we hear the God's word only, it doesn't mean then that we have this right relationship with God. Right? Paul continues, but the doers of the law will be justified. Right? That's how we come into a right relationship with God. Is we hear it, we have to hear it, right? We can't do what we don't know, right? I can't go and do a calculus problem because I've never taken that class. And I'm thankful to have never taken that class, right? But we have to hear it first. And when we hear it, then we have the opportunity to understand it. And when we understand it and we're learning about it, then we can do something about it, right? So the second part of the verse here talks about this being doers of the law will be justified. It's that action component. And when we're that doer of the law, then we have that right, we're being brought into that right relationship with God. So once God brings us into his truth by way of his calling, then we live according to that truth. And when we live according to that truth, then we are justified, right? We're justified. And as we continue through life, then we continue to be justified as we continuously live that life that's pleasing to God. But again, it's that doing aspect, not just the hearing. Right? Paul says that we're justified when we have a right relationship with God. And so sort of embedded in here, and we'll continue with this theme of being justified throughout the book. But the other footnote that we should drop here with verse 13 is that we can't earn our justification, right? We can't earn sort of that, I don't want to use the word title, but we can't earn that characteristic of being justified, right? Being just before God is not something we can earn. We can't earn a right relationship with God. It's a behavior. It's a way of life that we have. It's us being the doer, as he says here in verse 13. So we can't hear it. We can't sort of buy it. We can't earn it. The only way to have that right relationship with God, aka to be justified, as Paul says here at the end of verse 13, is to be a doer. Let's go over to the book of James one more time. James chapter 1. James 1:25, a great sort of parallel verse here. But he who looks into the perfect law of liberty and continues in it is not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work. This one will be blessed in what he does, right? So James here and Paul are sort of a tomato kind of a scenario, right? They're both saying the same thing, just again using different words. He who looks into the perfect law of liberty and continues in it, right? It takes both components and continues in it. He's not a forgetful hearer, right? He's not, oh yeah, I heard about that Sabbath thing. I heard about that one law of how we should treat, our fellow human. I heard about this thing one time. James is saying we're not that forgetful here, but rather we're a doer of the work. We're a doer. So the hearing leads to something. Let me start over. The hearing should lead us to becoming a doer, right? The hearing should lead us to becoming a doer. And in that doing, then, we have that right relationship with God. Okay, back to Romans chapter 2. Verse 14. For when the Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do the things in the law, these, although not having the law, are a law to themselves. This is another verse that, you maybe your head spins and you say, okay, can we read that one more time? Right? Lots of words here, and Paul sort of he sort of repeats himself partway through. So verse 14, when the Gentiles who do not have the law, okay, so the Gentiles have not been called on a large scale, they don't have the law, when they by nature do the things in the law. Okay, so this is a person who is not being called, has not been exposed to God's truth, but yet they sort of stumble over a principle, you might say, and they end up doing something in the law. When they do the things, when by nature do the things in the law, these, although not having the law, are a law to themselves. Most countries in the world have laws against murdering, but yet they still go to war with many of their neighbors. And so Paul is pointing out here in verse 14 that apart from God's law, man realizes there must be some laws to protect their civilization. Right? Every civilization since the beginning of time has had some laws that govern their civilization. So even when people disagree on right and wrong, there are things that everyone will agree on. Right? Almost everybody will agree that murder is wrong. Right? Almost everybody, regardless of your civilization, will agree that stealing is not right. That these things are inherently evil. And so Paul is not saying here that these human devised laws are equal to God's laws. Sort of a similar example perhaps is, we could use the examples maybe of being a good employee, right? If you show up on time, if you're a hard worker, if you don't cheat your boss, if you don't steal from the company, you're generally going to have a pretty good work experience. You might know of people, neighbors perhaps, or coworkers that seem to have a pretty good marriage, right? These are things that mankind has sort of bumped into some principles of God's way of life, and when they apply them, then there are sort of natural blessings that come from those things. Verse 15, who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and between themselves their thoughts accusing or else excusing them. Paul here brings in this conscience factor. The conscience is that middle part of our makeup that encourages us either toward right or wrong. It needs to be trained. It needs to be adjusted from time to time. It needs to be monitored. If you did not hear Mr. John Elliott's sermon, what's that been now, maybe about a month or so ago, he gave a great sermon on the conscience and steps that need to be taken in order to train and make those adjustments and monitor that conscience. Paul brings the importance of that here in verse 15. Verse 16, in the day when God will judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to the gospel. This is the same judgment that's referred to back up in verse 5. Right? Chapter 2 and verse 5 talks about this end of the age judgment. And here Paul makes reference to that again here in verse 16. This is not a judgment when you jump off the roof and there's that natural consequence of breaking or spraining your ankle. Right? This is the end of age judgment. It's a day coming when all people will be judged. There's no more secrets, you might say, at that time, as Paul points out here. All will be revealed. Let's look at a companion verse over in 1 Corinthians chapter 4. 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and in verse 5, writing to a different congregation here, the Apostle Paul says, therefore, judge nothing before the time until the Lord comes, who will both bring to light the hidden things of the darkness and reveal the counsels of the hearts. So Paul here is telling the church at Corinth in 1 Corinthians 4 and verse 5, essentially the same thing that he's telling the church at Rome back in Romans chapter 2 and verse 16. Right? There is coming a judgment when there will be no more secrets. All will be revealed. As he tells the church at Corinth, he'll bring to light the hidden things and reveal the counsels of the hearts, right? No more secrets. Everything will be revealed. The great companion verse here for verse 16 back in Romans. So that concludes section 2. Sort of this moral obligation is universal was sort of that title that we gave to it in the last Bible study. the second section here of chapter 2 of Romans, moral obligation is universal, right? That's sort of the summary of verses 12 through 16. There's a basis, and everyone should understand this basic way of life. Even Jonah going to Nineveh, there's a basic way of life. There's a basic expectation of right and wrong, and everyone will be judged accordingly. So section 3 then begins in verse 17 and runs down through the end of the chapter. I just want to cover the first part of it here this evening. Beginning in verse 17, this section largely deals with the concept that the Jews are just as guilty as the Gentiles. Remember, in our last Bible study, we talked quite a bit about the Jews elevating themselves because they had the Torah, they had this heritage, they were of Abraham's seed, and so therefore they kind of thumped their chest a little bit harder than the average person because of their heritage, because of the verses that they had memorized, because of their growing up with God's laws and understanding different things. They felt that they were just a little bit better than everybody else. And so here in this third section, this final section of chapter 2, from 17 down through the end of the chapter, and even a little bit into chapter 3, Paul is saying, no, hold on, guys. You Jews are just as guilty, right? You Jews are just as guilty as the Gentiles. Verse 17, indeed, you are called a Jew and rest on the law and make your boast in God and know his will and approve the things that are excellent, being instructed out of the law. The words that Paul uses here are very important to notate. Easier to continue these in the next couple of verses. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here in the notes. Verse 17 and 18, Paul is saying that the Jews had a great basis to the law. Again, they grew up with it, they understood it, they grew up keeping the festivals and the Sabbath, although they had their own traditions around it. They still had a basic understanding of God's way of life. It did not, however, make them superior like they felt that it did. The Jewish people would tend toward complacency because they possessed what they would refer to as the Torah. They considered it to be enough without having to practice it. Right? Just because they had it, just because they memorized it, going back to Paul's earlier statements, just because they heard it and knew it, they felt that it sort of excused them from having to do it. Right? They were hearers and not doers, and they felt that that was okay. With the Jews' understanding of the law, they prided themselves on the ability to guide others, their ability to teach others, and happily to judge others as well. Right? The Jews were okay with that as long as it was based on the law. They would point and say, "Oh, you shouldn't be doing that," but no, don't look at me. Right? You shouldn't be doing that. Right? And so the fingers were always pointing outward as they judged, as they attempted to teach and guide, and force the doing on others, but they themselves were okay with just the hearing, right? They were okay with not the full extent of the doing. Maybe an interesting side thought for us today is because God has revealed his truth to us, doesn't make us better, right? Doesn't make us better than others. It's a higher expectation of us hearing and being given God's Spirit to help us in the doing, but we have to be active with the doing as well. Verse 19, they're confident that you are a guide to the blind. Take note of the word blind. A light to those who are in darkness. This is another key word. An instructor of the foolish. Take note of that. A teacher of babes. Again, another word here, babes. Having the form of knowledge and truth in the law. These are words and phrases that the Jews would use to describe the Gentiles. Right? So it's interesting here that Paul is sort of turning this around. Remember sort of the summary of this section. right? The Jews are just as guilty as the Gentiles, right? The Jews have action that they need to do as well. The Jews have sins that they need to do as well, right? Stop misjudging people, right? What we talked about in the first part of chapter 2, everybody has sinned, verse 12 in that second section. And here his word choice in verses 19 and 20 is interesting because he's using a lot of the same words and phrases that the Jews themselves would use to condemn the Gentiles. And now Paul is flipping that around and using the same words back at the Jews. Paul is here exposing even a level of pride and bigotry that these people had, that this component of the congregation had. The Jews had presented themselves to the Gentiles as if they were the instructors, as if they were sort of the grand poobah, if you want to say it that way. And that the Gentiles were sort of a lesser citizen, a lesser Christian. The Jews presented themselves that they had the wisdom and the oracles of God, and the Gentiles were infants and childish and foolish. And so Paul uses language in verses 19 and 20 that turn it around and say, look in that mirror, right? Look back in that mirror, because these are phrases that you use for others, but I'm going to use them against you. Paul knew exactly how a self-righteous Jew would think and act, right? Because he formerly was one. He describes himself as a Pharisee of the Pharisees. Right, so he knew exactly how these individuals thought, what their motives were, and how they processed things and how they looked at others. He knew that because he himself had been one. And so sort of a secondary question for us to consider, something for us to ponder, then is our confidence based on God and his word and his law, or is our confidence in God based on some sort of special status? Right? This is what Paul is addressing with the Jews. You think that you have a confidence in God based on your status, right? You're a Jew. You grew up with this type of knowledge and information. You think that you're special because of that. And so maybe the modern day question for us here in this section is, where is our confidence based? Is our confidence based on the fact that we've been baptized for X number of years, we've kept so many X number of Passovers, that we have so many generations in our family, that maybe we're a pastor or we're an elder or a deacon, or we've been ordained to some level of office? Is that where we have our confidence in God? If not, or if we do, then these verses are for us. Right? Because Paul is telling the Jews, don't rely on that special status. Right? Your relationship is one-to-one with God. Right? And for us, we have the same examination that we need to have. Where is our confidence in God? It should be based on his word, on his truth, on the scriptures, on the relationship that we have with him. It should be based on us being justified with him, striving for that right way of life. Let's do a secondary verse here over in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 1. He says, now concerning things offered to idols, this is 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 1. Now concerning things offered to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. And if anyone thinks he knows anything, he knows nothing yet as he ought to know. Right? Paul is telling the church at Corinth, don't let the knowledge puff you up. Right? It's the same message he's giving to the Jews back there in Romans. Don't let your special status puff you up. Don't let the fact that you memorized a lot of the Torah and you've grown up this way of life, and you have this Jewish heritage and you can claim birthright through all the way back to Abraham, right? Don't let that be what identifies you. Right? Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. Okay, back to Romans chapter 2, verse 21. Here Paul condemns self-righteous hypocrisy. In verse 21, he says, "You therefore who teach another," again, this would have been largely directed at the Jews who saw themselves as the teachers and the guides and the judges. "You therefore who teach another, do you not teach yourself? You who preach that a man should not steal, do you steal?" It's easier to teach others how to conduct themselves rather than model that ourselves. It's always easier to teach it. Maybe you've heard of stories of ethics teachers or professors being fired for some unethical conduct. Right? It's sort of an interesting news article when those things come about. It's always easier to teach than to turn it around and apply it to ourselves and live according to our own words. And so Paul here is being very blunt from this perspective. Do you teach that you shouldn't steal, and yet you're stealing? Right? The Jews knew the law so well that they knew also how to excuse their actions. They sort of knew how to build with their own human traditions these loopholes, these ways out, right? And so they criticized others because of that. Notice verse 22 and 23. "You who say do not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who make your boast in the law, do you dishonor God through breaking of the law?" They would have read these words and said, "Oh no, of course not." And we too can think of ourselves fairly confidently because of what we know. But let's make sure that as we're going through this section that our words match our actions. Right? Okay, we profess to be Christians, but are we truly living by every word of God? Are we truly living according to the relationship that God has called us to? It's easy to discount some of these things. Do not commit adultery, but yet you do commit adultery. Right? We can say, well, I've not looked on another man's wife, or I've not looked on another woman's husband, or that sort of thing. And so this verse doesn't apply to me. Let's move on to the next one. But we know from a spiritual perspective that maybe we have committed adultery. Right? From a spiritual perspective, have we given credence to some false religion? Are we practicing, exercises based out of, Eastern religion? Are we dabbling in daily devotionals or other things that are contrived out of a different religion and a different Christ? Are we practicing some sort of spiritual adultery? We could say, "Oh, stay away from that," right? Don't commit adultery, but maybe we ourselves have some aspect of where we are. Maybe it's not physical, but maybe it is spiritual. "You who abhor idols, do you rob temples?" Right? An idol is something that we're worshiping or putting some sort of priority in front of in our life that ends up going above God. It ends up being placed above God. And we can say, "Oh, God is always first in my life." Okay, well, that might be true, but let's have the honest conversation within ourselves, within our own minds. Are we placing something at times over that relationship with God? Does the snooze alarm ever become an idol? As we snooze the alarm, now we've missed the time for the morning prayer and the study and that right relationship to start our day. Has that snooze alarm become some sort of idol? Or the resulting extra 10 or 20 or 30 minutes of sleep become something that prevents us to the point that now we're off robbing temples? "You who make your boast in the law, do you dishonor God through the breaking of the law?" We boast ourselves as Sabbath keepers, but are we doing things on the Sabbath to where we're breaking the Sabbath? Do we boast ourselves as who live this certain way of life, and yet we're off watching a certain kind of movie or listening to this or filling our free time with this one type of activity? These are things for us to consider. Verse 24, "For the name of God is blasphemed among Gentiles because of you, as it is written." Let's go back to Ezekiel 16. There's an interesting parallel back here in Ezekiel 16 to what Paul mentions here, that the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles. Ezekiel 16 and verse 27. God says, behold, therefore, this is Ezekiel 16, verse 27. Behold, therefore, I stretched out my hand against you, diminished your allotment, and gave you up to the will of those who hate you, the daughters of the Philistines, who were ashamed of your lewd behavior. God's saying, okay, I've turned you over to this sort of mindset because this is what you seem to be interested in. You want to go this way, so I've allowed you to go this way. And notice even the Philistines are ashamed, right? The Philistines who have these false idols, who have these Baals and these Ashtoreths and these false temples that they go into, these false gods that they're worshiping, even they are ashamed of your behavior. And so Paul's statement here in verse 24 isn't without basis. Right? There have been times in Israel's history that the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of their own actions. Isaiah 52 and verse 5, I'll let you read that later. That's another interesting companion verse that goes on with the supporting of what Paul is quoting here. Here we are seeing essentially the realism of the great Jewish contradiction between profession and practice. And one of our big takeaways from tonight is to be careful that we don't have a contradiction ourselves between those two. We profess one thing, but are we practicing it? Right? Don't let the profession and practice become separate islands. Right? Yes, profess it. Yes, acknowledge it. Yes, let that be who we are on the inside. Yes, let that be our daily motives and our daily mindset. But also it should be what we do. It goes back to that, don't just be hearers of the word. Right? The Jews wanted to be the teachers, the guides, the judges, but they weren't necessarily interested in fully doing it themselves. As Paul wraps up verse 24 here, he's exposing their contradiction. And so perhaps the takeaway for us is let us not have the same contradiction. Let us not have the same contradiction between professing and practice. And as he says, this has led to God's name being dishonored among the Gentiles. To the Jews, Paul is saying, you claim to be Christian, but the Gentiles have been watching you, and they've come to some conclusions about God that are not complimentary. Right? And he's saying it's your fault, right? It's your fault that the Jews are coming to conclusions that are not complimentary toward God. Okay, with that, we'll wrap it up here with verse 24. The next section begins a conversation about circumcision, and it sort of bleeds into chapter 3, and so I want to hold all of that to be able to discuss that segment in its entirety. So thanks for joining.